Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Archives online program, a book conversation with the author Philip Levy and his book, The Permanent Resident, Excavations and Explorations of George Washington's Life. My name is Ryan Smith. I am a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. I've published a number of studies on architectural history, also involving some of our founders such as Robert Morris. And I also had the great good fortune of working a long time ago back in grad school on an archaeological field school with our author today, with Phil Levy. And I've learned a lot from him back then, and I'm still learning things from him today. I'd like to give a brief introduction to Phil, and then we'll talk about the book and perhaps go through and see some images, and we'd love to take some questions from the YouTube chat if there are those that show up. So The Permanent Resident is a work that has come out of an enormous body of scholarship already from Phil. He's one of our most creative and prolific historians working today. He's worked across an impressive variety of fields, from historical archaeology, public history, memory studies, environmental history, combining those in ways that I think are unique across all of those different fields. Currently, he's a professor of history at the University of South Florida, where he's been since 2007. He earned a PhD at the College of William and Mary in 2001. He's got at least 3 previous books, most recently George Washington, Written Upon the Land, Nature, Memory, Myth, and the Landscape, published in 2015. Before that was Where the Cherry Tree Grew, The Story of Ferry Farm, George Washington's Boyhood Home, published in 2013. Before that, Fellow Travelers, Indians and Europeans Contesting the Early American Trail, published in 2007. And it's also worth noting that Phil has another book going to be published later this year on yard birds, on urban chicken farming throughout the United States. Phil has also published articles widely, the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, the Florida Historical Quarterly, the William and Mary Quarterly, among others. He's worked with the National Park Service on a new interpretive framework for the George Washington Birthplace National Monument in Westmoreland County. And since 2002, he has led or helped lead the Ferry Farm Archaeological Field School, bringing hundreds of his students from the University of South Florida up to the Fredericksburg area to participate in that annual field school there. Maybe we should also observe that Phil is a state champion old-time fiddler as well. So an incredible range of experience and expertise there. I think, turning to our book under discussion today, The Permanent Resident, this is a book that could only be written by Phil Levy. It combines this deep, multi-methodological approach with a really unique and engaging voice that his readers have come to appreciate and to love. I think it offers us a brand new model for biography, for how to tell a life history and to connect that life history not only to the landscape, but to the history of the nation and even beyond. And I think it manages to say something new in almost every chapter and as a whole about America's perhaps most studied, most prominent historical figure in George Washington. And so I want to thank the National Archives for hosting us here. First question for Phil, and let him introduce himself if I've missed anything here. But Phil, is this a biography? Is this an archaeological biography? Describe what this book is for us.
Well, thanks, Ryan, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in today, and thanks to the National Archives also, who've been very helpful in my work over the years and in this book in particular. So everybody should get a chance to visit. There's a lot to see and some amazing stuff to play with. And thanks for that introduction. I always want to be that person. That's a great person. Who is that person? I hope I can be that. So you asked the question: is it a biography? Biography is an interesting genre, right? When I wrote the book I wrote in 2015, I wrote a chapter about Washington biographies, and I read about not their entirety. I'm not that self-punishing, but I read probably about 150 biographies. Mostly these 19th century biographies are just dreadful, because what tends to happen with biography is, particularly in earlier biographies, biographers will just read 3 or 4 previous biographies and then just write their own. So the same thing happens with movies. If somebody makes a Columbus movie, Christopher Columbus, they just watch the 3 previous Columbus movies and then, do their take. So biography is a strange genre in that way. And Washington there's a whole history of Washington biography and what happens in them. I had never thought of myself as a biographer, but I did find that when I wanted to write about these sites, let me step back, I obviously worked a lot on the sites of Washington's childhood, having excavated them, and then written about them in a couple different books and articles, as you mentioned. So I kind of started to get a sense of how I could approach this, the kind of questions I could ask, and what the data would let me do. But what I also developed over time was a familiarity with a set of characters, discussions, and references. And I started to realize that everybody who works in this sort of milieu, this Washington space, we all refer to certain people, there's certain characters, certain iconic moments, people who are referred to by their first name, and everybody who works in this world knows exactly what you're talking about. So there's a vocabulary that developed, and I started to conceptualize this book before I set out to write it. Is that what didn't exist was a sort of study of these different sites that tried to bring them all together. I thought maybe we could do this as an essay volume, but in the end, I just said I kind of wanted to do this myself, and I had to have a framework. How am I going to do this? Like, what am I going to just write about sites randomly? Writing about 1 or 2 sites and sort of expanding them. And you know this from your own work. When you have, it's something our work shares, is a sense of sort of placed base, right? That there's an object at the center of this, and that's where the gravity is, and everything sort of, in some kind of site-centric world, is sort of connected in some way, and that is the glue. Well, that works with one site kind of fabulously. What do you do with multiple sites? And I started to realize that the way to approach this was to use the framework of Washington's life, the biography, the narrative of his biography, as a sort of conceptual spine. So let's move through the sites as they sort of happen in the Washington biography. And in that way, maybe what we can do is use a ground-up model and sort of see what we learn. Now, the catch, of course, and we'll probably talk more about this, is that sites are never restricted only to the era that might be at the center of the research agenda. So we may come in wanting to know about Washington as George, something about his life, but we have to deal with the 1930s, and we have to deal with excavations, from the turn of the century. In some cases, we have to deal with the Civil War. All these things become part of our sites, and they become our responsibility too. And all of those sort of connect in and become in some way part of the Washington story by simply sharing that space. So it's biographical in that way, but it's this, how do you turn place-centric into biography? That's what I was playing with. Well,
yeah, I can't think of another work on any historical figure that takes that place-based methodology and strings it together across a life history the way that you've done for Washington here. I think it's worth mentioning the sites that you cover in these successive chapters, beginning with his birth there along Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, moving to Ferry Farm, the childhood home outside of Fredericksburg. Then there's a chapter on Barbados and Bush Hill and the Bell Plantation and some of the other sites there. Returning to the continental United States with Fort Necessity, and then moving back to Mount Vernon and looking at some of the slave quarters and his arrangements of Mount Vernon there. From there, you move up to Philadelphia to describe his time as president of the United States with the President's House Project, and then concluding the book in a phenomenal chapter on Washington's memorial landscape, more broadly speaking, in terms of statues and plaques and other commemoratives. And so the reader gets to see, as you say, through this place-based study and through those layers, kind of his birth through his youth, his early career, his later career, and then kind of his afterlife, moving from spot to spot. You talk about the importance of historical archaeology overall in your method, and you've already talked about memory. Those things seem to come together for you in the concept of stratigraphy or layers in each of these sites and those earlier biographies. But in the introduction, you also use a word for some of this Washingtonology, right? Can you say a little bit more about Washingtonology? What is Washingtonology? It's more than just the historical archaeology. It's more than just the architectural history. It's more than just the artifacts that survive. It's more than just the lore. Talk to me a little bit about that term and this concept that you built the book around.
Sure. That was an early title for the project. So I had files that were called Washingtonology when I was writing this before we ended up with this, I think, far better title. Better because it's a quote from Washington himself. But yeah. So the dilemma that the term Washingtonology solved for me, the problem it solved, was that I've got objects, I've got sites, I've got memories. So some of these things are tangible, some of them are mobile, some of them are place-based, some of them are part of the ground and therefore are demolished in the excavation, and some of them are conceptual. Yet they're all sort of tied together by being, by being connected through this character and this set of stories. So I wanted a term that sort of encompassed all of that, so that I didn't have to sort of restate that every time I wanted to invoke this thing, right? So I kind of landed on this term. There's a book called Custerology that sort of did this. And I thought, well, look, you can do it with Custer, you certainly can do it with Washington. But this was a way, archaeologists will often refer not just to archaeology as the discipline, the practice of archaeology, but will refer to an excavation or the findings from the excavation as the archaeology. We'll have to look at the archaeology. Well, I saw the archaeology. So sort of using it in that way, it was my catch-all to sort of put these things together and say that they're all sort of linked. They all sort of share connection. And they do in some cases share fairly direct connection, like we might talk about it later, but in the chapter on Barbados, one of the things I talked about, and this is one of the things that was really enjoyable about that chapter, other than sort of doing the research in Barbados, was actually taking Barbados seriously. Barbados is usually a quick little moment in the Washington biography, a little, sun-drenched, colorful diversion before we get to the real stuff, which is, of course, the 7 Years' War. And Barbados is significant. Barbados plays more of an interesting role than people tend to give it credit for. And I sort of explored that a little in this. What I'm working on now is going to explore that more in the next book that hopefully I've done next year. But one of the things that I saw going there was at the Bush Hill site, which is the home that Washington and his brother Lawrence rented when they spent the winter and spring in Barbados in 1751, and where Washington got smallpox rather famously, the house they rented. The excavations there didn't turn up a lot from the period. It's very hard to isolate one person's habitation in a site that had been occupied for a very long period of time. But they did find some plateware that was typical of the 1750s and 1760s. And that plateware, the pattern on it was called white salt glazed stoneware, and the pattern on it was the same pattern as we saw at Ferry Farm. So these two places in two completely different parts of the empire, but tied into the same sets of trade networks in very similar kinds of economies, end up with exactly the same plate on the table. And you can't say that George used this particular plate, but it's a wonderful way to kind of get how empire would function, how empire manifests itself sort of at your table. You're from Virginia. Here's what your world looks like. Here's what you eat off of. We're used to this because of the way consumerism functions in our world. But the 18th century is a lot more idiosyncratic and local. And so you go across the ocean, you spend the longest time away from the continent you'd ever been. You go to sea for a month, you get seasick, you eat weird fish, you end up somewhere else where everything's different, and you sit down to have dinner, and you're seeing, at least theoretically, the same table settings you have at home. That is empire. That's sort of an important manifestation of it. Now, how do you describe that object? I sort of say, well, those are bits of Washingtonology. That's sort of how that phrase helped me, how that word.
Yeah, I thought that was beautifully done. I thought that was an incredible chapter. I know you've got some images. Maybe it's worth pulling up a couple of those images from Barbados. I thought that your example of using those ceramics as a way to show us how Washington would have envisioned empire, encountered empire, as you say, after a month at sea and eating then on those same plates. But the chapter goes so far beyond that too. You talk about the different types of spaces, the different types of plantations. Of course, this also helps us think about Washington's engagement with slavery. There's the whole smallpox episode. And so for me, one of my takeaways from the book is the importance of that Barbados instance in that whole Washingtonology field. And also the way you pivot around not only what does Barbados mean to Washington, but what does Washington mean to Barbados? And so that's love to hear you just elaborate on that a little bit more too.
Let's look at some pictures of the beautiful island. Let's get that shared, and I'll just open up this fully here. So we should talk a little bit about the visit. So this is from the second tier of hills in Barbados looking southward. So if you go straight enough south, you'll eventually hit Trinidad, I guess, and then South America. But Barbados, if anybody's been there, you know Barbados it's in the West Indies, but it's not a Caribbean island. It's not volcanic. It's not made the same way the other islands are. So it's got a completely different kind of vegetation, a very different landscape. It's coral, and there are highways that are cut through. They cut through coral. So you're going through these sort of white coral walls of highway cut. So this is looking south. This is a view that Washington wrote about. So he sees the sea in the distance and the land sort of spread out. And it's still agriculture. It's an island population of about 350,000 people, mostly clustered along the south end around Bridgetown, the capital, which would be off to our right as we look at this. This is from the back end of the Drax plantation. So we're looking south. I had driven up to the Drax plantation, which is a 17th century building, still occupied, still used as a sugar plantation. It's an amazing thing, still operating almost as one would have in the 17th century, and owned by a family in Britain who are absentee landlords. It's nothing in that respect has changed from the 1680s or 1660s. The difference, of course, is enslavement, destruction of the economy, and so on. It's not really the same. But this is a view that Washington would have seen. One of the things that Washington was struck by when he went to Barbados that matters immensely is he saw people. He was wealthy, and he came from a wealthy family. The Washingtons, his family were probably, we could say, they're in sort of the top 10% of wealth for Virginians. So they're not wealthy, super wealthy by the standards of the really big guys in the colony, but they're locally extremely wealthy. They're very well connected. And most Virginians would have, looked upward to what they had and aspired to it. When Augustine Washington died, 1743, he had somewhere in the range of about 10,000 acres and business interests also. He divided a lot of that land up, but they're well taken care of. But his father has around 10,000 acres. His father's passed away at this point, but had about 10,000 acres and was wealthy, but not super wealthy. So George and Lawrence wash up in a place where there are people who have 350 acres of land. Mm-hmm. They are staggeringly more wealthy than the Washingtons were. And he writes this in his journal. I mean, he's writing down the numbers of the acres that people have. He's clearly kind of blown away by this. People have what are, by Virginia standards, tiny land holdings are so much wealthier than Virginians and Virginians in his experience. And it has to do with sugar. Sugar is just a more profitable commodity. Barbados, as historians have said for a long time, is devoted to the development of this commodity. So that's part of its trade relation to Virginia. Virginia can produce food supplies that you don't want to grow in Barbados. You don't waste your land with corn. If you can import it, you import it. You don't cattle herd here. You might have a cow, but you don't have a herd of cattle grazing. You turn this into sugar land, and everybody does. And that island was a patchwork of tiny holdings with dozens and dozens, hundreds of planters, just making a ton of money off of this. So he's a little astounded by this and wrote about it at length, was sort of intrigued by it. He also saw the slave system operative, didn't write a lot about it, but he did note in a sort of interesting aside. I always find this kind of fascinating, and it bears on the way Barbados remembers Washington, I think, in some ways. It seems pretty clear to me from what's happening in his diary of the trip that he and his brother arrived. They came through the connection to the Fairfax family because it's genealogy stuff, right? It always gets a little confusing. But William Fairfax, who was Lawrence's father-in-law, had married a Massachusetts woman named Deborah Clark. Deborah Clark's brother, Gedney, lived on Barbados and was like one of the wealthiest guys on the island. In fact, when his business went bust about a decade later, it had huge economic impact for the island. So he's a very big deal on the island. So along come these two Virginians, young men, one married, one not. George was about 19, from a place that has a very long-standing trade relationship with Barbados. So they see Virginians, right? They're familiar with Virginians. Along come these two guys. They walk off the boat and into one of the most prominent homes on the island, one of the most important people. And young George is not married. So it's really clear from just reading the periphery of his diary that the planters of the island are scrubbing up their daughters and kind of pushing them out in front of him, hoping for a beneficial trade relationship. He is meeting a lot of women, having a lot of dinners with a lot of different women, and he's just not impressed by any of them. In fact, he's really quite disparaging, and he disparages them in interesting racially tinted tones because one of his concerns, the one he mentions, is that they speak it with a dialect and an accent that sounds like the enslaved people. So what he's telling us in some roundabout way is that there is an emerging West Indian accent. There's a West Indian approach to English in his time, and he's hearing it, and he doesn't like it. He's not happy with what he hears. But that's the thing he mentions.
And yet he describes himself as being ravished by the island.
Which is his word, which I just find fascinating. That and that's a really specific word. And thanks to digital technologies, we have we have the ability to kind of go through writing, metadata writing in a way that we were not able to, even a decade and a half ago. And you can see some really interesting things. The word ravished, he uses twice in the context of Barbados, I believe, and then doesn't use again. He talks about it in that way and then drops the word from his vocabulary. And the only time, at least what I've been able to tell by doing the metadata work on the correspondence, the only other time it appears in the correspondence is later during the revolution to refer to rape. So there's an incident on Staten Island. There are a couple times when he talks about British soldiers ravaging women. And there we know exactly what that means. But he describes himself as being ravaged by the island. And what does that mean? Clearly it's some kind of enchantment. Something has, I don't mean that in some mystical sense, but clearly this place had an effect on him. It shook him in some ways and stayed with him. And it stayed with him enough that he brought at least two, and I could be mistaken that there are more, but at least two that I know of, pieces of coral back from Barbados, which he kept with him the rest of his life. And those pieces exist at Mount Vernon. They're in the museum at Mount Vernon. They're in the collection. So that's a big deal. Travel, we travel all the time, right? We're travelers, all of us. We get in the car and we travel distances, sometimes, if we're really unlucky, just to go to work, that are distances that would have staggered people in the 18th century who were all homebodies. Travel is a big deal, a transformative experience, and for many people, it leads to them doing their only literary event in their lives. That's a remarkable thing. And he kept a diary. He was writing a bit of a diary before, but this place stuck with him, and he sort of it resonated. And this is part of that view. This is part of what captured him. Sorry, go ahead. You were going to ask something.
I was just going to say, it's a really insightful, creative chapter, as you say, that goes from those tiny bits of coral that he returns from, as well as his diary stuff, and then the spaces, the architectural spaces of the island. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the book engages with slavery overall, because, of course, it's not just Barbados. We see slavery figuring, of course, throughout Washington's life. So are there other images or spaces? Do you see a common theme or trajectory? In your chapter on Mount Vernon, you describe his changing approach to slavery, his contradictory approach to slavery, that I find really useful in comparing it to these earlier experiences in his life, say at Barbados or in his childhood home.
Sure. Well, let's look at some pictures from Barbados. Let's look at some buildings and sort of work out from there, because these are all places of enslavement. That gets lost in some ways when we look at them. But this is the Drax Hall. This is that 17th century plantation that was, if you turn around, you get something like that view. This is probably a 19th century building in Bridgetown, but it's understood as, people say it's 18th century, but it's probably not. But this is an 18th century townhouse in Barbados. So when Washington came to Barbados and he stayed with the Clarks at first before they rented, as far as we know, he probably stayed in Bridgetown. We know that they dined in Bridgetown, and probably not in this building. I think the genealogy of this building is known, but this is what an 18th century building, 18th century townhouse looks like. And so what you have immediately is a space that's completely different than the kind of space he would have understood. In some ways, it's much like an 18th century home in Virginia. You have sort of an entryway, which you can see, very large door windows that sort of open, family rooms above, public rooms below, and servants and slaves living higher up. But what you have here that affects the way slavery functions, it's very different than what you have in Mount Vernon, is you don't have the insularity of the plantation. You don't have sort of an entire system all around you. You have a slavery system around you, but it's an urban one that has coming and going and mixing in a way that's very different. This ties in, I think, when we get to Philadelphia, because he's confronted in Philadelphia with moving his slave system into an urban space that, in that case, is not like Bridgetown, is not accommodating to enslavement. and that becomes a real problem. But this is again not the building that he was in, as far as we know, but very much like the one he would have seen or would have visited. But out in the countryside, there's a plantation which you mentioned before called Bell. This just sits out there. Barbados has the best collection of 18th century buildings in the West Indies. They're just all over the place. And they're in differing states of repair. Some are in fabulous shape and are being used. The Barbados National Trust is housed in an 18th century building, beautiful building. Some of them are just have been repurposed again and again and serve some sort of industrial use. This is on a construction lot. So there's behind you, if you were standing, there would be a sort of an open barrack with trucks inside of it. So people coming and going, nobody seems to mind that you're there taking a look at this. Nobody really cares. I think tourists show up every now and then, although I don't know how many people might associate this with Washington. The reason why you might is because at the time when Washington was there, this plantation was owned by Gedney Clark. And Washington records going out into the country and visiting. He doesn't say Bell, but he visits the Clark plantation. And there are other ones, but this is a local knowledge has this as the one that Washington visited. And since the doors are open, you go in because why not? And you poke around and you try to look between floorboards and see if you can tell when beams were cut to see whether they're sawn or hewn, try to get a sense of the age of the building. But this is the 18th century core of the building. So it's entirely possible that Washington was in this. It's also entirely possible that this is where he contracted smallpox. When he visited, he knew that a member of the Clark family had smallpox and was sort of hiding out, was kept separate from everybody when they had this dinner. So he's in a house that has smallpox, but these houses are very small, very compact and crowded, which also, again, returns to slavery, that all this stuff, you have to have the family living here and all of the enslaved people also sort of moving in and out of this space. So these are wonderful examples of the differing landscapes that enslavement creates, that you move through these places as a free person one way, but the enslaved have a whole sort of alternate landscape, as Del Upton's written about, sort of, that they move through differently. And so when you see these small compressed places, you realize that all these different landscapes sort of converge in this one domestic space that is domestic for some and labor for others. So, and he's just kind of moving in this world, and he's familiar with it, obviously coming from a world of enslavement, but there's a compression in Barbados because the place itself is tiny. Everything is scaled down. In Virginia, you just expand and you can look out and you see acres. In George's case, the ferry at Ferry Farm that takes its 19th century name from, that sat at the bottom of at the drop down at the river, there's a bell there. And when people would come to get the ferry over, they'd ring the bell and then they'd wait for the ferry to come over. And he wrote a letter, one of his first letters that we have that has survived in 1749, where he's complaining to his brother about how bothered they are by the noise of the ferry bell and the people coming through. So they're not even that close. I mean, they're close, but they're close by Virginia standards. And that's the issue, is that the aspiration is to sort of be, kind of in your space, to be, suzerain of your domain. I always think of the way Shirley Plantation is, which I know you visited at some point, but anybody, if you get to visit Shirley, it's a wonderful example of this, because you go up through those roads and these kind of dirt roads that take you through trees, and you rise up onto these open fields and you can see it off on the right, and it's like a town. It's like you are arriving at a town, and it is indeed that. It's this this place of life and labor, but you see it in the distance and everything around it is open. There would have been more buildings in the 18th century, but the sense of openness, you don't get that in Barbados. Everything's compressed, and the compression in some ways is part of why he got smallpox, because everybody's all so close together that when he goes and visits these people, he ends up contracting the virus. So moved away from slavery there, but that's, he's moving through those spaces. This is just to tie it up, this is the home that they stayed in, massively changed from what they lived in. It's to the point where, it's incredibly complicated, like these buildings tend to be, but this building has been changed and changed and changed. To the point where it doesn't resemble its original self at all. If you this is the front of it. The only part that's 18th century is that doorway in the middle and the windows on either side, although that wouldn't have been the doorway. The original building is that thing in the center that has the cellar outline. So you see that everything is blank white. The only part that isn't is that cellar area. That's the building that Lawrence and George rented. And in fact, it faced the water. I guess this is hard to see, but it's kind of facing off toward the water, whereas now it's reoriented and faces away. So the building just massively changed. but the museum's done a beautiful job of restoring and interpreting it. And this is the core of it. This is the home that they rented, with the two rooms are sort of broken up by this table, kind of straddling them. But one room would be on one side, one would be the other. The front is to the right. That would look out on Carlisle Bay and Bridgetown. And then there'd be loft rooms above. So we do know that when Washington was ill with smallpox, this is where he stayed. And this is also when they did excavations here in 1999, 2000. This was the site they found the ceramic that's similar to the stuff at Prairie Farm. So, and again, they rented enslaved people when they were here, and there were quarters for the enslaved people sort of to our left, kind of behind this building.
I think that's a really beautiful part of the book, where you're able to take your own experience with excavations at Ferry Farm, at the National Birthplace, or others that you've actually been the one doing some of that excavation yourself, and then being able to read, converse with the expertise of other archaeologists, such as those that did the excavations there at Barbados or at the President's House, or at so many other sites. And it's just really seamless throughout the book. Do you have thoughts on working with the materials from other archaeologists?
Yeah, it's not easy. Fortunately, all the work that I saw, looking at really good work. The 1930s work is good by its standard, but no, archaeology has many correct ways. There are many correct ways to do archaeology. They don't always align. Units may be measured differently. Artifact collection systems vary over time. Fortunately, like I say, the sites I was working with were all well excavated, so I didn't have the problem of, except the 1930s, which is a long time ago. I think the hardest thing about it was not that so much as that all the straightforward conclusions had been taken, right? I mean, the low-hanging fruit, has also been claimed. So by the people who are doing the work, they're seeing the stuff. They are making, the central observations. They're doing the identification. It's hard to come along later. I'm not interested in disagreeing with them, although I think some things I would challenge, not in any disruptive or harmful way, but we might think of this differently, think of that differently. I think a building at Mount Vernon, for example, has been misnamed, but that goes back, at least to the 1960s. So an institutional name. But we'll turn to slavery and talk about that. But I think the hardest thing is that, if you're going to write a unique book, if you're going to write your own book, I have to figure out what I want to say about these things. And that was what made this a challenge. In some ways, this was an extremely challenging book, because I didn't want to just repeat other people's findings. I didn't want to write a compendium of other people's work. I wanted to use what they had, but then try to tie these things together and try to make them speak to one another, which I don't know that I did as much as I would have wanted to. But the idea is to get these things to talk to one another.
What I was going to say, I think the concept of the book itself is really path-breaking, assembling a person's life, or what we can learn about them and their engagement with the wider world through these various places. But then you do push yourself, and you do achieve some of those insights, so that I, as a reader, really can't see any of those sites that you've worked us through in a way that I saw them before. So I think the payoff there is just huge. I wonder if we could talk about Fort Necessity a little bit. I thought that the way you dealt with his early military experience, obviously we know about a bit of his humiliation there at the start of the French and Indian conflict in that colonial war with France, and his surrender at Fort Necessity. But you bridge that surviving, which was so great to see, those oak posts or pales, and then with the fabric, the cloth that was so integral to Washington's view of himself at that time, and that would stay with him going forward. So how, when you're thinking about his early military experiences, does this material culture shape, how did you make that connection between cloth and wood?
So that's a great question. That was very enjoyable. It took a long time to get that right and sort of, hammer that out. And we go back to Barbados. So when the people who've written about Barbados, largely Barbadian historians, who have an understandable interest in sort of making their case for why Barbados matters. And some of that work is wonderful, and some of it kind of overstates the case. And one of the things in the overstatement is to say the things he learned about in Barbados that shaped who he was. And I understand that impulse, but it doesn't quite work. So you get things like that. Some of the people that he had dinner with were Jacobins, people who had or Jacobites, sorry, who had rebelled against the crown. And like maybe he learned about rebellion there. So, well, Hugh Mercer lives across the river. He sold Ferry Farm to Hugh Mercer, and Mercer was a Jacobite. So he's got, he doesn't have to go to Barbados to meet those people. They're in Virginia. So you don't need that. But one of the things that comes up again and again is that this is, I would argue, the first time that Washington saw proper British redcoats. He would have seen the militia many times. He may have seen soldiers. He probably saw military vessels, not many of them, but some. On the Potomac, less likely the Rappahannock. But he may well have seen some of these, but not like what he would have seen in Barbados. Because Barbados is it's a slave economy, overwhelmingly populated by enslaved people who need to be controlled in order for the people who are exploiting them to feel safe. So it's quite the opposite of the way the American Revolution plays out. You want to put troops in homes in Boston, and people get really angry and feel their rights violated. Nothing makes a white Barbadian planter happy than seeing troops everywhere and frigates in the water. They want to see that military display. And so there are forts all over the place. And the home that they rented was right by one of these forts. So he saw military activity. He saw forts in a way he'd never seen before. You can't say that he developed an interest from that. He was reading about military stuff from the first records we have of his, is him trading with cousins for books about soldiers. He's had a long interest in this, but it crystallizes then. And what I see happening is he then goes back to Virginia and he gets sent off on his first military expeditions, first as an emissary and then leading men. And when he's leading the men, when he sets that up, he's riding back and forth with Governor Dinwiddie, who's sort of commanding this, enterprise from the background. Washington is a lieutenant; he's not in command at first. But he's writing about how the men need to be outfitted in red. And clothing matters immensely in this time in a way that it's hard for us to grasp. If you were just a regular poor guy, the kind of guy who would sign up for a military expedition, which means you don't have a lot of land, you don't have a lot of prospects, and you'll take the bounty. It's like it's worth the risk. But one of the things you get for this is a suit of clothes. Right. You are given what will probably be the nicest suit of clothing that you have. And that's why soldiers dress like gentlemen in the 18th century. It's recruitment inducement. They want to walk around looking good. It's their chance to look good. And it's a huge incentive. And Washington writes about it being a huge incentive, but they have to be red. And he really insists on this. And he basically came back from his visit to the French forts the year before. He comes back and he tells Dinwiddie that they have to be red. This line fascinates me. He said that because the French they don't look good and the Indians don't respect them. And there's no basis for this in reality. He doesn't have the experience at that point to be able to make that claim. And it's also just not true. It's just not how this works. Right? It's not how indigenous people, their allies, are understanding the French. And so,
that's why he's there in the first place.
Yeah, they're doing well. They're not having trouble with this. So they have to dress in red. I think something else is going on, which is that he's seen what British soldiers look like, and he wants to have his own men dressed in red. And he manages to do this. And then clothing is a strange leitmotif throughout this expedition. There are storehouses that have clothing in them. There are issues of clothing. And when they get to, I won't go into too much, I want people to read the book, right? But when they get to Fort Necessity, there are all sorts of issues with clothing that emerge. One of his officers, when he's captured, finds his suitcase being taken from him, and the suitcase breaks open, and his suit of flaming regimentals are shown. And it's the presence of the suit of flaming regimentals that make the French soldiers that are stealing the suit back off. I mean, which is a great statement in of itself. These guys are so in the class system of the 18th century military that all that matters is this guy is an officer. Like, doesn't matter what army he's in, he's still an officer, and they just back off. But it's the clothing that proves his identity. You can't have that clothing without having the status. So the clothes play a huge role in this. So when it comes to the actual fort, there's nothing you could do to say that Fort Necessity is a success by any stretch of the imagination. It's a military disaster and well acknowledged, and nobody could really challenge that. But I think we've misread the fort, because the fort is often treated as an anomaly, an amateur, someone who doesn't know what he's doing, all of which is true, right? He is an amateur. He doesn't really know what he's doing. Thinks he does, a little cocky about it, but no, he's out of his depth, and on some level he knows that. And this is all done hastily as sort of a place to put to put material and equipment and ultimately to hide the wounded. It's not meant to be a fortification in the sense that it could withstand a bombardment. And they built earthworks outside and they set cannons outside of them. But one of the things we see in the excavation, this is a Park Service excavation going back into the 50s and earlier, in fact, but the remains are still there. Because the fort was burned, a lot of the French burned it when they left, after they captured it and left. A lot of the wood survives in the ground. So we can see the wood. It's actually there. The Park Service has some on display. You can go see it. And they have more in their collection. So you can actually, there's a lot there. And they are split pieces of white oak. We can tell the tree. And that struck me as really interesting for a couple different reasons. For one thing, this is a mixed forest. It's not, there are other hardwoods there. But the pylons, the pales are made of white oak. So, and white oak is the kind of gold standard hardwood for 18th century Virginians. He's writing about white oak all the time. He wants white oak scantlings for the repairs to Mount Vernon. The white oak is the best wood you can get. So something's happening where these guys they perceive, they're correct. The French are coming to get them and they're trying to build a fortification, but they're being selective about the trees. Like only some trees are going to work, right? That's really interesting. That's very Virginian. They are picking the trees that make sense to them as Virginians. And then they split them, which I still can't figure out. I don't think that's a labor-saving move. People have said, well, that's to save labor. But if you time it out, it actually doesn't save labor. The crews that are doing this, the soldiers that are doing this are, these are the ones that are later going to build Braddock's Road. These people know what they're doing. They can cut down forests fast. They're tough as nails. But then they're good at doing things quickly, but you still need time. So splitting is an interesting choice. He splits them and they put them outward. So the white of this oak is all facing outward. And as sort of hinted, I kind of see that in the way you can see a garment. That this is a dress. This is a attire. It's a statement of more solidity than this construction actually has. There's really no other reason to do it. It doesn't save you anything. It doesn't make it stronger. It doesn't make it faster, but it does make it white and projects it outward. And it fits in with the way Virginians do things. These like deeply ingrained vernacular habits. The split wood is just so typical of that space and the way they operate. So it's almost like they're just trying to create something familiar. He's having them create something familiar, like a safety blanket or something.
I thought that was so revealing. The white kind of circular enclosure that was projecting this image the same way that the cloth, and the wool of the uniform was projecting an image.
And so it works. It works. The French are actually kind of think that the French are convinced that they're up against a much larger force than they are, because the brashness that Washington shows, and killing Jumonville, and getting into the weeds on the military stuff, but the brashness of the action leads the French to conclude this has to be a large force. No small force would do this. This has to be a big force. And then they see this fort and they're a little intimidated, even though they outnumber them. I'm not going to give you a number, but it's easily 5-1. They are a much larger force. But in a way, I mean, if it's a fake, I don't know that. I'm not going to say that it's intentional fake. It's some kind of masterful genius. It's not that. I think he's doing what Virginians do. He's building a Virginia enclosure, and it happens to have this effect.
And you trace that through the rest of his military career. Some of those lessons he takes with him in a productive way with the Continental Army. I wonder if I could shift gears and challenge you a little bit, or ask you, if we learn so much about Washington himself, the way he presented himself, we learn a little bit less in this book about Martha, who of course is, basically the second half of the book. She's an intimate part of his life. What was your thinking, your choice in approaching her as a feature of this landscape, as a participant, as an agent of some of these spaces, and helping them to come about, or helping George to navigate those same spaces?
So she appears, she's at two of the sites that I write about. So she's at Mount Vernon, she's at the President's House. And it's true, I don't talk about her that much. And she's hard to talk about because she is in some ways occluded by Washington, right? So there is some stuff, but even the Flora Fraser's biography of the two of them is centers on George and their activity together. So she's sort of there. She is most prominent in my work going back to slavery because of the bottle seal, the Custis bottle seal that appears at the bottom of the slave quarter at Mount Vernon that puts a date on the building of that. Like, in order for that building to be there, in order for that bottle to be there, that had to be after the marriage. And since it's at the very bottom layers, that suggests that that building is new to that period. So this marriage sort of manifests itself in the presence of an object from another plantation brought over by marriage, and then ends up in the quarter for the enslaved. So it sort of ends up in a tricky way. When talking about the president's house, what I was interested in was sort of the regimes of discipline, how you deal with the regimes of discipline. So again, she's not much in focus because it's hard to tell the correspondence that Washington had with Tobias Lear when he was building, sort of making recommendations to Morris's house. This is fun because we get into your world really quickly with this, where our characters converge, right? The correspondence that they have back and forth, and Lear sort of making his recommendations and getting his recommendations from George. It's very hard to tell how much is coming from George and how much might be coming from Martha. It's hard to tell. Some of it is clearly his concern, and there are, I can't swear to it, but I know there are correspondences between them where they haggle a little bit, at least with Mount Vernon, over the names of certain buildings. I remember reading that the two of them sort of go back and forth about what the name of the building is going to be, meaning what its purpose is going to be. He has one vision and she has another. So she did not end up being super prominent in this work because I think she's occluded somewhat by the kind of stuff I'm looking at. The other thing, just as a tie-in, is that because I'm working sort of upward from material, it's very hard to take an object and tie it to an individual person. It's extremely difficult to do. That's why things that have initials on them are sort of fetishized and wonderful, but they're rare and far between. At the president's house, for example, the Park Service will tell you correctly that their excavation from the early 2000s didn't find anything that they can identify to Washington's habitation. They do have the footers for expansions to the home that he ordered, so those are Washington things, but they mean there's no plate service, there's no object that says GW, there's nothing that they can say this was in the president's house at that moment. There are ceramics from that period, but that period is too big to be able to say it's there. So they don't have anything like that. So the entire Washington family in that respect is sort of hidden by the nature of artifacts.
And I think you make the point really well that George Washington himself, as opposed to Martha, George is exceptionally focused on the form of things, the shape of things. He likes to draw things up. He likes to talk about what color of the paint they're going to use for this or that. He's asking his colleagues for design ideas on ice houses and on greenhouses and other things. And so just as a character himself, George seems to be, this is foremost of the way he's operating, as a historical figure during that time period.
Yeah, he's a bit of a magpie, isn't he? He sort of, he goes somewhere and he sees somebody with a nice window, and he's like, "Yeah, I gotta get one of them windows." And, he sees a nice cupola on top of there. He's like, "I get one of those." So, he sees things and he likes them, and he starts drafting up plans for how to get them. That sort of drafting of plans, to return to the issue of slavery, I think is an important thing because that has a big impact on Mount Vernon. I mentioned that the slave quarter, which would seem to be the documents say that they're finishing it out in 1760. So it would seem to be new, and it has archaeology in the form of that wine bottle seal that puts it right in that period. Marriage is 58, so it's right around that time. That building stood for 25, 30 years and then gets replaced. And it's replaced by two brick buildings, more or less on the same site, one on the same site, one a little further away, that basically double the size of the original quarter. But what's interesting about that to me is that the drafting, he knew he was going to change that area. He was writing about it in the 1770s to his plantation manager, his kinsman Lund Washington, saying that he wanted to redo that area. There was a wall he wanted to put in. He wanted to make changes. He wanted to improve the way the garden functioned, which this building is right up against. And then they start doing it in the 1790s. So a lot of it happens while he's away as president. But he's sort of drafting these plans, and he draws them up. I think I could bring them up for you. He draws them up right after the revolution. And dig them up here. That's the president's house. Where are we? We do have them here, don't we? So he drew them up. I don't have them. Yeah, they're there. Sure. Bring this up for everybody. He drew two plans of this. So at the center of this is a greenhouse. This is what you would see. This has been rebuilt at Mount Vernon. So you would go see the rebuilt version of this. The rebuilt version sits on top of the archaeology, so that is true to what was actually in the ground. Burned in the 19th century, was replaced again. It has its own story, like a lot of these things. But these are the two drawings from the Mount Vernon collection, the collection library at Mount Vernon, that George drew up for the greenhouse in the center and wings for the slave quarters on the left and right. The one he ended up going with was a version of Plan 2, the bottom one, that divides in two. But even this isn't quite right, because one of the things that happens is that you'll notice that these buildings, the wings, are centered on the gables, the short ends of the rectangle of the center building, whereas they actually align. They align with the top end, so it's one solid line. It's a more solid wall. But he was drafting this after the Revolution and around the time that he was having discussions with the Marquis de Lafayette, where, as we know, Francois Furstenberg's written about this really well, that Lafayette was an ardent opponent of slavery and was appealing to Washington to join him in enterprises of freeing enslaved people. Lafayette had one going on in Guyana. It ends up kind of falling apart during the context of the French Revolution, but he set freed people up in village settings and had them working as farmers, not as enslaved people. And he was urging Washington to do the same thing, was suggesting maybe some of your properties in West Virginia, you could do this, or Western Virginia at the time, maybe you could do this with. And Washington entertains the idea. He doesn't follow through, but he's thinking about it, something, I guess. But he's hearing these discussions, he's having these discussions. And we usually will say, and nothing really comes of it, which, on one level is true. But we weren't looking at the landscape and the archaeology and recognizing that this revision of the housing for the enslaved happens amidst that discussion. And he ends up building a new version of this at the end of his life. So something is happening there. He goes from having them living in a wooden building to living in two brick buildings. The buildings being more solid, more weathertight. If comfortable is the word we want to use, that's a little tricky to say. But it's very difficult in my mind to separate the discussions he's having about slavery with this sort of revision of the slave housing. And this is the slave housing, I should add, that is closest to Mount Vernon. There's slave housing all over the 5 farms, but this is the stuff that he would see most visibly on a daily basis. These are the people who are working the immediate land around him and the various enterprises that are happening in Mount Vernon. So in some ways, this revision of architecture, this rethinking of slave housing, is in dialogue with these discussions he's having after the Revolution. And he has other visitors. People are coming to him and writing to him and sending him abolitionist pamphlets and, arguing against the slave trade, which is really the focus in that period. It's less a focus on the abolition of slavery as such and more a curtailing of the slave trade. That's sort of more the issue.
I think this is such a great example of how you're, again, using the material record, that Washingtonology, to show us something new about what Washington has to say about slavery, rather than just looking through his letters, rather than just looking at his will, obviously through his buying and selling, but through what he does through these material statements as well. We've only got just a few minutes left, but I don't want to leave the conversation without picking up on your last chapter, your conclusion, which is I think worth the price of the book alone. It deals with the modern memorial, in some cases not so modern, memorial controversies surrounding George Washington's likeness, statues, images, plaques. Opens with the story of those plaques in Christ Church there in Alexandria, one for Washington, one for Lee, that were put up in the 19th century. And I'll just read a couple of quotes. You say, Washington's memorials have been knocked about and moved around in the past, sometimes by accident, sometimes to send some vague political message, but always with little enduring damage to the Republic. That kind of a way that you're able to say this in a way that's exciting, that helps us contextualize all this stuff, is just so fresh. But I want to ask you, Phil, you say ultimately the hand-wringing over the imagined impending demise of all things Washington was disingenuous. It was more distraction than call to action. And then you propose what you mean. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by seeing some of this hand-wringing or opposition as disingenuous to actually supporting Washington's legacy?
And that ties specifically to that Lee plaque controversy, which if people know, I might cover in the book, but there were these twin plaques dating to around the time of Lee's death. And the way they did it was symmetrically. They put one up to Lee in the church, and then they put one up to George at the same time. And this goes back to the naming of the university, Washington and Lee. I mean, this sort of using Washington in some ways to shelter Lee, as Lee is becoming problematic in the wake of the Civil War. And so come the events of 2020 and the summer where Washington statues were damaged and all the events surrounding that, the church decided to not remove, not destroy, but move the plaques. So they moved them from the front wall to the atrium area that you come into, where there were already other commemorative plaques. So in other words, they're just moving them to a different place. As monument removals go, this is a pretty minor event, and the kind of thing that, but for the national furor over this, nobody would have even noticed. This was a decision by the vestry. Their reasoning is perfectly sound. They're right in line with their own church doctrine on issues of race and the Confederacy. They're just doing, they're doing what they're doing, and it's fine. Not exactly having a destruction. And of course, the same church has an enormous bronze plaque to the pallbearers who carried Washington's casket, right? So there's an enormous commemoration of Washington outside, and Washington was there, and there's pew and so on. And there was a whole lot of concern about it, and people were sort of dragging it up and using it and getting quite histrionic, making a lot of, offering a lot of attacks. And that's fine. I understand the feeling of something being under threat. I mean, I work in the world of preservation. I'm aware of the feeling of seeing things that you care about being jeopardized. I get that. But the reality is that this is a pretty bad example of that happening. However, and this is why I say disingenuous, I felt almost as if, right, so welcome to the world of being concerned about the maintenance and preservation of old things. Right. Thank you for expressing this concern. Now let's have a real conversation about what is in fact jeopardizing the historic physical patrimony of the past for Americans. And it's things like underfunding the Park Service to the point where deferred maintenance jeopardizes historical structures. Yeah. It's not having preservation funds to make sure that land is preserved for Civil War battlefields. Like, that's really where the issue is. It's not this plaque that's the problem. It's a much bigger issue of how we are in many cases building over and damaging things that are irreplaceable. So if we're going to have a discussion about preservation, let's have that discussion. But the place we have to go first is making sure that we are preserving the things that we have already, and that there is some security in that, not wringing our hands about whether a plaque got moved from the front of the church to the back of the church. And unless you're on board with this, then it just seems to me to be disingenuous. Like, let's fix this problem if you're identifying the problem.
And reaching that point of yours after seeing what that material record at all those various localities, some owned by the Park Service, some owned by private organizations, it really brings that point home to, without that material record, we would know so much less about his legacy, his life. And so turning the conversation in that way, I think is a real contribution, and one that I haven't heard very much of. So I thought it was a really elegant, smart way to end the book. With just 1 minute or 2 minutes left, I can't resist showing off your cover. I adore the cover. Any final thoughts here about the book or the cover itself here, Phil?
So that was, presses will routinely ask you if you have any suggestions for the cover, and then they go off and do their stuff because they're designers, they know what they're doing. They asked me if I had any ideas, and I, just as a hobby, just a thing of pastime, I paint, and I have a whole lot of paintings. There's several in this office, and I've done several paintings of Washington, and that was one of them. I sent them two rather more serious ones and one sort of jokey one, and they loved the jokey one, and now it's on the cover of the book. So I mean, I love it. I'm very, very happy, and I'm available to do other people's book covers as they come along. So perfectly happy to talk with you about your book project. But they didn't use a painting of mine for the chicken book. I was hoping we would do that, but what are you gonna do? But so I have a painting of mine on a book cover. It's very fun to look at that book cover for me. Oh.
It's very inviting. It stands out. It's unique, just like all your work here, Phil. So look forward to seeing all your other books. And thanks for sharing your time with us here today.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the National Archives, and thank all the people who stopped in to hear us talk.
Very good. Take care, everybody.